We've been following the stories of John Solomon, and now we're learning a lot. We're also learning the testimony behind closed doors of Bruce Orr, and he's telling everybody he warned everyone at the DOJ, the FBI, the upper echelon, and even Andrew Weissman of Mueller's team, that, in fact, the dossier was unverified. Christopher Steele hated Trump, and it was paid for by Hillary. Now we have, for the first time, direct evidence, thanks to John Solomon's great reporting earlier in the week, and that is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Kathleen Kavalek's written account of an October 11th, 2016 meeting with FBI informant Christopher Steele and the Clinton campaign-funded, British intelligence operative, admitting his research was, in fact, political with an election day deadline. Now, that was said 10 days before the FBI, according to the Grassley, Graham, Nunes memos, used a FISA application with the bulk of that information being the Russian disinformation, according to the New York Times, but discredited dossier. Well, now it takes an even deeper turn. Just breaking now. By the way, new Hour 2, Sean Hannity Show, 800-941-SEAN is our toll-free number. Literally just in the last minute, the updated column by John Solomon, investigative reporter with The Hill. The FBI Steele story is now falling apart completely because of the intelligence being false, media contacts that were flagged before the FISA application in October that, in spite of what Comey says, there was no spying, spied on Carter Page and spied on the Trump campaign, and he should know because he signed that first warrant. And we have newly unearthed memos show that, in fact, a high-ranking government official who met with Steele in October 2016 determined some of Donald Trump's dirt was simultaneously digging up for both the FBI and Clinton's campaign was inaccurate. They knew it was inaccurate. And remember, Steele was getting paid by the FBI even at this time, and by a Russian oligarchs, and by Hillary Clinton, and by the DNC. Great gig for one piece of information if you can get it. John Solomon gives us the details. He joins us now. How are you?
I'm doing well, Sean. Yeah, you got this one right. This is a very big revelation. And let me tell you what's happened. Since the last story broke, the State Department has released more documents about Steele's contact with Kathleen Kavalek, that Deputy Assistant Secretary you mentioned. It's all on this October 11th meeting. So it turns out she also had a set of handwritten notes. And they originally gave us a typed memo and they redacted most of the information out of it. That's now been unredacted so we can see what she wrote. And what she wrote is very significant to the question of FISA abuses. Let me set it up just quickly. Let's remind everybody that in the first application for the FISA on October 21st, 2016, the FBI said that they considered Steele reliable, accurate, and they had no derogatory information on him. Now I'm going to take you to Kathleen Kavalek's notes, which, by the way, she distributed to the intelligence community right after she met with Steele. She writes that she detected he was inaccurate or erroneous with one of his allegations involving Donald Trump and alleged Russia collusion. Let me tell you what the allegation was. There was somehow Manafort and Carter Page and all those Trump people who've now been shown not to have colluded with Russia. They were working with the Russians on a hacking operation, and the people who were doing the hacking were getting paid out of the Russian consulate in Miami. And immediately after Kathleen Kavalek hears it, she writes in her notes, boy, that doesn't add up. There is no such thing as a Russian consulate in Miami. They don't even have a consulate in Miami. So the very allegation Steele was making in real time, she debunked in her notes and in her memo immediately. That's very important. That's considered derogatory information, inaccurate information from an FBI source. The second thing she detected that would be a real problem is that she wrote down, he told her on 2 occasions during her meeting that he was leaking to the Washington Post and the New York Times. An FBI confidential informant may not leak to the news media while he's working for the FBI unless instructed by the FBI. These revelations occurred 10 days before the FISA. She sends this email up the chain. It is improbable that the FBI didn't know it. It means that there was substantial evidence, not only that Christopher Steele was admitted he was partisan and had an election day deadline, it was determined he was giving the government false and inaccurate information, and he was leaking to the news media. All 3 things are derogatory information under the standard.
And it ended up getting him fired. I believe it was November. Am I wrong on that?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So, and then the interesting thing is, we know from closed door testimony, he stayed in contact with Bruce Orr, then the fourth highest ranking member of the Department of Justice. And we know from notes of Bruce Orr that Christopher Steele was desperately trying to get information, even though he'd been fired for lying and leaking.
That's right.
To the special counsel. And we know that Andrew Weissman, Mueller's number one, had been briefed by Bruce Orr about the contents being false and questionable and put together by a Trump hater and paid for by Hillary. And, of course, Weissman was the guy that was at Hillary's victory party the night of the election. Yep. Didn't turn out to be one, but he was there. And Jeannie Ray, of course, was an attorney for the Clintons on the foundation. So what you're really saying here is there is no excuse. There is now direct evidence that shows that all of these people that signed off on that FISA application, the first one, that they were told, and they were told directly, that this is unverified. We now know it's, by the way, John, we know it's unverifiable because Steele doesn't stand behind it.
Yep,
and
that's right.
That Hillary paid for it, and that Steele hated Trump and had an agenda.
Yeah, and keep in mind that the timing of his firing was after they had already used him to secure the dossier, right? They used Steele, and then they dump him a few weeks later. There is now incontrovertible evidence that the FBI should have known and had grounds for firing Christopher Steele before the FISA warrant was issued, meaning they should not have used him to get this warrant, and here's why.
Well, they were paying him, John. They were actually giving him money for the same thing that Hillary and her... And the DNC, which she controlled the finances of.
They were planning to pay him, but they ended up not paying him because they fired him. But this is very important. He's already.
But didn't he get paid beforehand?
For other work, prior work. That's correct, but not related to the Russia-Trump investigation. He never got paid for the Russia-Trump investigation by the FBI. He was going to be paid, but then he got fired before he could get his paycheck. But here is the important thing. It doesn't matter whether he's paid or not. As soon as he has an informant agreement with the FBI, he breaks protocol, goes to the State Department. That's a violation. He gives inaccurate information to the government. That's a violation. He acknowledges he's leaking to the news media. That's a violation. All of those things were established by October 10th, 10 days before they used him for the FISA warrant. This is the most incontrovertible evidence that the FBI should have and almost certainly did know Christopher Steele did have derogatory information. He was rogue. He was political. He was inaccurate. He was in violation of his agreement, and yet they continued to use his information until they got their FISA warrant, and then they threw him under the bus after the fact.
So the question then remains that if there's no way they could have verified the dossier, correct?
Right.
Okay, I've been making the point. Now, we know James Comey signed the first FISA application. Again, I can replay Rod Rosenstein's words again, but Rod Rosenstein says, no, in a FISA application, you need a career law enforcement officer to the best of the knowledge and ability that what they're signing off to is accurate and true and been verified. And if that's not the case, there are major consequences. So there's no way that Comey or anyone in the FBI could have verified something that is unverifiable because the dossier author, Christopher Steele, in an interrogatory says, I don't have any idea if any of it's true. New York Times is now suggesting it was Russian disinformation. I'd like to ask this question because I know there's issues about whether Mueller will testify. I want to know when he knew that there was no, quote, collusion or conspiracy with Russia. Number two, why didn't he tell the American people and the president? Number three, I want to know about Robert Mueller, if he's investigating Russia influence in our elections and the chaos that ensued. Well, we know that this dossier was leaked to the media. Korn and Isikoff, the Washington Post, to name a few. You're also reporting that Steele was passing out information of the dossier to others, correct?
And the New York Times and Washington Post are specifically cited. In fact, he says in the notes, he's quoted in the notes as saying they had the information almost as soon as he started his work in June and July.
All right, quick break. More of this blockbuster investigative report, John Solomon. All right, as we continue with John Solomon's new blockbuster investigative report, Obviously, he was with the Hill, and he'll be joining us on TV tonight. So how does Mueller justify doing an investigation on Russian interference, know all about this, and not even blink an eye and go into it?
You said something before that's really important. The FBI has not been able to verify, but let's say something it could have done. It was able to debunk very specific information very quickly. I found 5 things in these notes that within 1 hour I was able to debunk by making a couple phone calls and a couple Google searches.
Go through the 5 things.
Yeah, I'm going to give them to you in a second. The State Department woman, during the meeting, detected something that was overtly false by Steele, right? There's no such thing as a Russian consulate in Miami. That allegation can't be true. Well, I was able to confirm that one of the allegations is that Carter Page met with the head of Gazprom. We know that's not true. That he met with a senior intelligence officer. We know that's not true. How did I know that? I called them and I called the Russians, and they both said, no, we never met with each other. They said, the notes say Paul Manafort had a $100 million debt he owed Russia. There's no record of a debt in Russia or in the United States. It was never found by Mueller. That was overtly, it could be checked in 5-10 minutes and be determined if it's true or not. And here's the big one. In these notes, just like in the dossier, it said Michael Cohen went to Prague. We now know from Mueller's report there's no visa record of Michael Cohen in Prague. In less than a half hour or hour of diligence, the FBI could have found 5 factually false things in the information Steele was providing him.
So what you're saying then is they absolutely did zero due diligence in what they ended up presenting to the FISA court. And
there's only 2 possibilities. They did no diligence.
Okay, and then, but more importantly, they knew, which means that they were willing to commit a fraud on the court, and they did commit a conspiracy to commit a fraud on the court, because at the top of, I just found this out, John Ratcliffe has said, verified is actually at the top of the
That's right.
actual...
It says the word verified application. It does that on every one of the 4. And there's no evidence that the allegations are verified as we now know them. In fact, there were many things that could have been debunked on a few hours' notice. There's only 2 possibilities.
How did Mueller not even ask a single question about this then?
Well, we don't know what he asked behind closed doors. He certainly doesn't make any mention of the report except.
Well, but hang on a second. He had time for taxi medallions, FARA violations from the 80s. He had time for loan applications and time for taxes that were not paid, but he didn't have time for real Russia collusion. And his mandate was so broad it sent him out in 1,000 other directions.
One of the things that I think we should look for if Special Counsel Mueller finally testifies next week, if he's allowed to testify, is the question of did he communicate concerns to the Justice Department and to the IG? There is a strong possibility from the reporting I've done that Director Mueller very quickly dismissed the dossier as a piece of garbage and may have reported his concerns to the Justice Department and possibly to the IG. That would be a very significant revelation if the Mueller did that. It would suggest he understood the origins of this case were flawed from the beginning. That would be if he didn't, then he ignored the pretty clear willful evidence that this was a bad investigation at the beginning. Either one is not a good scenario for the people who ran this investigation. Everything we're talking about here that went on, ignorance, political involvement, are contrary to what FBI agents are trained to do when they do counterintelligence investigations. This is the antithesis of a traditional counterintelligence investigation.
All right. Great work, John Solomon.